Welcome to the CircuitPython Show. I'm your host, Tod Kurt, taking over hosting duties from the show's actual host, Paul Cutler, so that he can be a guest. Paul has been using computers since a young age, but did learn to code until he was in his 40s. Paul has been contributing to open source projects for almost 20 years, including the GNOME project and the Discogs Python client. When he's not in front of his computer, you can find him listening to records from his vinyl record collection. Paul, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for guest hosting.
Hey, my pleasure. I love the CircuitPython Show. So I guess we should get to start with your background. How did you first get started with computers and electronics?
You know, I've been pretty privileged that I've been around computers almost my entire life. I was probably 9 or 10 when we got our first computer, which was a Timex Sinclair TS-1000, which was really a modified Sinclair ZX81 is what the rest of the world knew it as. Mm-hmm. And then we got a second one. We got the TS-1500, which was a ZX Spectrum just a year or two later. And I played around with those for a couple of years. You know, I remember getting those magazines that were made out of newspaper and entering assembly code, trying to program them. You make one little mistake and you just want to tear your hair out. But after a couple of years, we got an Apple IIc, and I played around with that. And we got a 300 baud modem, which was screaming fast at the time. And I got really into the bulletin board system scene. I loved BBSs. And later we had a 1200 baud modem. And I would actually go to, in real life, meetups with the different folks I met in the BBS as a teenager. And from there, it's just a lifelong love of computers.
That's great. So when was the time you started getting into open source? Was it during the Apple II days, or was it later?
Oh, it was much later. I was a full-blown adult, and it's the fault of the game EverQuest, of all things. So EverQuest came out in 99. And you could cheat at EverQuest if you had a Linux computer. And I just happened to have a second computer. I had been playing around with BOS, actually, a little bit. And then I had actually purchased Red Hat Linux from a retail store 6 months earlier, but it just sat in my closet until we started playing EQ with all my friends. And I realized I could take that second computer, put Linux on it, and cheat at the game, which was great. I know.
That's cool.
So I started using Linux, and I had the second computer next to my gaming computer. And the more I used it, the more I liked it. And I really loved the ethos that anyone could contribute to it. And after probably 4 or 5 years of using Linux, this would probably be around 2004, 2005, I had done all the different distro hopping that people had done. I had tried Ubuntu and I had tried Fedora. And by the mid to late 2000s, I found a very small Linux distribution called Foresight, which isn't around anymore. But one of the things that they really tried to do was be really close to upstream GNOME. So I started contributing to Foresight, which led me to contributing to GNOME. And I got really into that. I joined the marketing team and the sysadmin team, even though I didn't really have a lot of sysadmin skills, but I had project management skills, which are always needed in open source projects.
Yes, very much.
And then I started writing a ton of documentation. I served 1 term on the board of directors. And
wow.
And it's been 10 or 15 years since I probably left that scene, but I loved it so much. I've made lifelong friends in that community.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if you were a GNOME or a KDE guy, but I guess that answers that question.
Oh yeah, I'm a GNOME guy. There's no doubt about that. And one of the things that I'm probably most proud of is I was one of the first mentors for the GNOME outreach program for women that was started in 2010. So I mentored a couple of women for documentation, and that program is still around. It's known today as the Outreachy program. Outreachy is still around, and it offers paid internships for those subject to systemic bias and underrepresentation in tech, and it promotes diversity in open source. So it's kind of cool that it's still around after all these years.
That's great. Yeah, the whole the very underlooked aspect of open source, I think, is the management and documentation of the projects. It's like everyone's like, oh, just write the good code, put it up on a repo, and you're done. It's like, no, that's just the start.
You're absolutely right.
Especially for really complex projects like a distro or a big GUI application. There's so many different levels of the code, the OS integration, the artwork. It's just a huge task.
You're absolutely right. And I didn't know how to code at all when I was contributing. So I'm an example that you don't have to know how to code to be able to give back to an open source project.
Right. So, but at some point you got into Python after playing around with all this open source stuff.
I did.
Like, how did that happen?
I had an itch. I really wanted to learn programming. My wife is a developer, and I had an itch to do it. I had time on my hands, and it was something that I've always wanted to do, but never had the discipline to do it. So I went out and I bought a couple of Python books and realized very quickly that I don't learn from books. I learn from video courses and from hands-on projects is what I learned through the process. So I took a course on Coursera with Dr. Chuck, which taught me the basics of Python. What's a string? What's an int? How to manipulate strings and all that kind of fun stuff. And then right when I was getting into it, Michael Kennedy, who hosts the Talk Python to Me podcast, started Talk Python training, and he had a Kickstarter of Learn Python by creating 10 apps. So it was very project-based, and it was perfect. So I bought that Kickstarter, and then I kept buying classes from Talk Python to Me. The way he teaches really clicked for me, and it taught me not just Python, but I learned web frameworks like Pyramid, and a couple of years later, I learned the Fast API web framework as well. So I'm a big fan of the Talk Python to Me classes and strongly recommend them for people that are looking to get into Python.
Oh, that's cool. We should put that in the show notes, I think, then, yeah?
Absolutely. I'll link to that.
Right on. And then how long did it take you to find CircuitPython? Like when sort of in the history of CircuitPython did you come in and start playing with that?
So I started Python in about 2017, and I got into CircuitPython because I was into Python. I attended PyCon virtually in 2020 during the pandemic. So it was the first PyCon I ever attended, which was pretty cool. And Microsoft had a virtual booth at PyCon. And if you did an exercise they had these exercises built into GitHub, and if you learned and did the exercise, you got a $50 Adafruit gift card. And then they had a bonus exercise, and I walked away with $100 in Adafruit gift cards. So I did what probably everyone does when you're first starting out with Adafruit products. I bought a Circuit Playground Express. Yep. And it probably sat in my drawer for a good 6 months before I got it back out. But it was during the pandemic, and all we had was time on our hands. And then I started playing around with that and quickly fell in love with CircuitPython. It took two things that I love, the coding aspect of it, but combined with that physical world aspect of it. Here's a device that you can touch and feel. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, I've bounced off of Python, like normal desktop Python, many times over the last 20 years or whatever. Always, learned enough to do a project, and then kind of, I finished the project and then it leaves my brain. And I've been really happy with CircuitPython as a way to just learn Python. I don't know any of the web frameworks yet. Like you're talking about, Fast
API.
Fast API, yeah. I don't know anything. I don't know any of the real Python frameworks, but I think I'm pretty cognizant of how Python thinks in a way that I could actually learn those now, whereas I definitely could not before.
Yeah, Fast API was a fun one to learn because it was one of the fastest growing Python applications out there, and it's async, which is great for a web server, and learning that taught me a lot about how to program asynchronously, as well as using the latest and greatest things that are out there.
And you've got some project now that you've created that marries both desktop Python and Fast API and CircuitPython, right?
I do. It's probably the project I'm most proud of. I have a website called silversaucer.com that you can visit. It was inspired by a Neil Gaiman poem, of all things. And it combines my love of vinyl records, Python, and CircuitPython. So I learned how to use the Discogs API, and Discogs is a website that's been around for about 25 years, and they crowdsource all the different records and cassettes and CDs that are out there. So for example, Pearl Jam's debut album 10 has almost 300 different versions worldwide. Each country had their own CD, and people have entered all this data into there to catalog each specific release. Yeah. So I have a fairly large vinyl record collection, as listeners know, and I wanted to learn how to interact with an API, and I wanted to learn how to use Fast API. So I built a site, and it only does three things. There's three buttons on the front. One is a random button. It'll randomly choose an album for me to go play. It's just an inspiration for me.
So anyone on the internet can say, hey, Paul, go, just randomly go pick an album.
It'll pick an album for them, but it doesn't tell me anything.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Now, if I'm logged in, there's some different functionality when it comes to the CircuitPython stuff, but I'll get to that in a minute.
Right.
And then there's a play button, and that shows you a list of every record I have, and you can select a record, and then it'll show you the album art and the song list underneath it once it loads. And then there's another feature that I built called On This Day that I scraped both Discogs and Music Brains with my collection to figure out which day a certain album was ever released.
Oh, cool.
So, which is another way that I get inspired to go listen to an album. It's like, for example, and this is kind of a funny one, yesterday or today, Debbie Gibson's Electric Youth came out in 1989, which is a record that I happen to own. I love 80s pop music, so, don't laugh at me too hard. But it's a great way to just go pick a record off the shelf and say, hey, I'm going to listen to this now.
Yeah,
so once I started getting into CircuitPython, I realized that I could take it a step further. Now, my record player is in another room. It's on the opposite side of the wall of my home office down here in my basement. So it's only about 10 feet away, but the record sleeve is in there, so I can't see the album art. So I have a Pi portal, and I decided using the Discogs API, it shows me that the album art, it downloads the JPEG that's displayed on the website. Well, using the Pillow library, I took that album art, I reformatted it to a PyPortal size, which I think is about 300 pixels or 320 pixels. Yeah. And when that web page loads, if I'm the user who's logged in, it will then send a message using MQTT over Adafruit.io, and the PyPortal is listening for that MQTT message. And once that page loads and sends the message, the PyPortal goes out to my web server, downloads the album art, and displays it. So that's how I kind of married desktop Python with CircuitPython.
So it's a little thing that sits on your desk and it just displays the album art, and that's great. As soon as you play an album, that's cool. Yeah.
Yep. As soon as I choose that album to play on the website. And then late last year, I bought a 64 by 64 RGB matrix and did the same thing again. But now it looks like pixel art because this is a 64 by 64 image. It's tiny by the time it shrinks it down.
Yeah, totally.
But it was kind of cool, and now I'm actually considering doing it for a third time and picking up one of those S3 Qualia boards with one of the RGB dot clock displays that are a little bigger than a PyPortal. But I haven't spent the money on that yet.
Yeah, and the color rendition of those displays, like they're both like higher density or higher resolution. They're like up to 480 by 480, I think. But also they're like, I think they're 6-bit per channel color instead of the sort of mostly 5-bit per channel that the other displays used on microcontrollers are. So it's like, man, we get to drive these like real displays in CircuitPython. It's kind of incredible.
Exactly. And probably the next time I order something from Adafruit, I'll pick one of those up and do the whole project all over again.
Totally. Yeah, and there's no OS, so it just starts up.
Exactly.
So where we talk about like Qualia is one of the new things that's going on in CircuitPython. What are some other things you're excited about that's coming up in CircuitPython? Because it's kind of ever evolving. There's new things happening all the time. What are some of the things that you've seen?
The first two things that come to mind are, the first is the Memento camera. I have been waiting for that thing to come back in stock. And I just think it's so cool. Not only is it an open source hardware camera, it's programmable. And every time I think of a different way to program it, it seems like there's already a learn guide to do it. Whether it's, using a remote or stop motion or creating GIFs. And I just think that thing is cool, and I can't wait to get my hands on one. The second one that comes to mind is USB host. That combined with support with the new bigger RGB dot clock displays makes me wonder, and Scott Shawcroft actually mentioned this in his CircuitPython 2024 blog post, how close are we to a little mini CircuitPython powered computer, right? When you have a computer or a keyboard with a display, it can't be that far away. Now, I know that USB host only works on the IMX and the RP2040 chipsets right now, and those dot clock displays work on the S3, so there's going to have to be some work done probably to get to that point. But that's one of the things that I think I'm really excited for in the future.
Yeah, we're really close to something that is very much like the old Sinclair ZX81s or the Timex one you had, where it's just this little box and you just turn it on and you've got a full little language-based computer you can type programs into without any like worrying about, is it on the net? Is it running OS? All this kind of stuff. It's just, all it does is the language. It does BASIC in the case of the ZX81, or it does CircuitPython in the case of this hopeful new thing we could make in like a year or so. It's very cool.
Exactly.
Yeah, the camera, the Memento camera is pretty great because it takes a bunch of stuff that's been here and there. Like there's been a camera you can hook up to an ESP32 for a while, and there's been like, SD card support for a while and all this other sort of stuff, screens, of course. And now it's a whole thing. It's like it's got the camera, the screen, a little microphone, a little speaker, SD card, Wi-Fi, and and you can access all of this via CircuitPython and make it do things that a camera can do.
Right, and it just works.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting. It's one of the things that I think people need to realize about CircuitPython that has taken me a while is it's sort of like Legos, where if you've got the pieces available to you, you can snick them together to form new things. But if you don't have the right Lego piece, you can't do stuff. So for a while, for the longest time, there wasn't camera. Like the camera Lego piece in CircuitPython didn't exist, but now it does. And so I think it's pretty cool that we're getting more and more of these cool little Lego pieces that we can do stuff with.
Oh, I agree. It is so cool to watch the development happen in real time.
So we got all these new things that are definitely coming up. What are some of the things you want to see CircuitPython do in the future?
One of the things I'd like to see is more options for Bluetooth. So we've got the NRF boards that are out there. And with CircuitPython 9, they've updated the Espressif IDF, the IoT development framework. Yeah. And I believe that there are still some changes upstream in the Nimble library that need to happen before CircuitPython can take advantage of Bluetooth on an S3 chip. But I think it'll be, considering all the different places we're seeing these S3 chips now, right? The Qualia boards, the Memento camera, everything we just talked about, adding Bluetooth, it just seems to be the next step. And that's one thing I would personally like to see.
Yeah, definitely. These ESP32 S3 chips are so powerful with their, they've got dual core, I think, and they've got Wi-Fi and they've got Bluetooth. But, getting the Bluetooth stuff has been not quite working on CircuitPython. And I think there's even been problems with it when you're writing programs in C and stuff. And so I can't wait for that, because it's pretty cool to have a little Bluetooth gizmo that talks to your phone or whatever. And because you can get cool notifications from your phone. You can control your phone in various ways, have it be a MIDI device or an audio device or something.
Right.
So yeah. This isn't the end of the show yet, but I wanted to also thank you for the last, 2 years of doing the CircuitPython show. I think it was a very critical tool to help get people to learn about CircuitPython and get people who are doing some of the CircuitPython stuff, kind of get them out there into the world. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been my pleasure. The developers and hackers and makers that I've gotten to talk to, it's been so cool getting to know all these people and seeing all the cool projects that are done. It's sad in a way that the show's coming to an end, but I think it's time. But yeah, the last 2 years have just been wonderful, and being able to meet everyone.
Especially a good thing to let us do instead of worrying about the pandemic for the last couple of years.
Exactly. And that's one of the reasons why I started it, is I was looking for a hobby in addition to, CircuitPython and Python and just coding. And it was a great learning experience on how to cut up audio and audio production and all that kind of fun stuff. I've learned a ton.
Totally. Yeah. These are your 2 standard questions you have at the end of the podcast. If anyone wants to learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
They can visit my homepage at paulcutler.org. I have a blog there that I infrequently update, like most people these days. But I also have a projects page that lists all the different projects I've worked on over the last couple of years, with screenshots and links to the GitHub repos and all that kind of fun stuff.
Oh, so that's smart.
That would be the place to go.
Yeah, I should do that. That's a good idea. And lastly, so you're going to start a new CircuitPython project. What board are you reaching for to first start prototyping or building with?
I'm going to go with the one that we've been talking about so much, as well as the same one that Jeff Epler picked in the last episode, which is a QtPy S3 with 2 megs of PS RAM. I don't typically need a lot of GPIO, so the QtPys are perfect for me with that small little footprint. And like we were just talking about, the S3 is such a powerful chip. And I've really, really enjoyed working with Wi-Fi. A number of my projects use Wi-Fi, whether it's downloading images or controlling my home theater receiver remotely, I love built-in Wi-Fi on those chips.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the ESP32 S3 chips. Also, not even when using them for Wi-Fi. Like I've used a ton of them for non-internet projects because their little processor in them is so fast. They can do a lot of mathy type operations if you're doing like synthesizers or stuff. So yeah, big fan of that chip as well. Paul, thanks so much for being on the show and hosting the other shows and creating the CircuitPython Show. Transcripts are available in most podcast players, and show notes are available at www.circuitpythonshow.com. Thanks for listening and stay positive.